Hello, everybody. I'm Marka Bristow, and I'm going to be your MC tonight. I think I know most everybody in the room, but for those of you who don't know me, I am president and CEO and co-founder of Access Living. Access Living is Chicago's Center for Independent Living. We're proud of the work that we do to act as a social change agent on behalf of people with all different kinds of disabilities and assist them with the services that they need to be more independent and more empowered. I'm so very happy to be here this evening with all of you. This is a bringing together of a lot of different parts of my life and of our Chicago community. So I hope that after the formal program is over, you will all take the time to mingle with each other. Why we asked you to put the organizational name on here, because I think some of you don't know each other, and there's great energy and collaboration possibilities here. Before I start the formal program, I'd like to say a special thank you to this evening's co-hosts of the organization. In addition to Access Living, we're really pleased to collaborate tonight with the Center for Disability and Elder Law, Equip for Equality, Heartland Alliance International, Loyola University Chicago School of Law, John Marshall Law School, the Mayor's Office of People with Disabilities, Sargent Shriver National Center on Poverty Law, the United Nations Association Greater Chicago Chapter, and World Chicago. I'd also like to say a special thank you to representatives of our Young Professionals Council, Russell Zimmerman, Justin Cooper, Glenna Sullivan, and Kelsey Waters, who are here serving us and helping this evening, and of course to the wonderful Access Living staff, Aziza Nassar and Katrina Ballerini, who helped put this evening together. And finally, I know most people do the thank yous at the end, but none of this would have happened without the great technical support behind the scenes of Elizabeth Lauren. So could I just have a little round of applause for all of us? It is really my honor to be able to introduce Illinois' Attorney General, Lisa Madigan. I think most folks in this room know her as Lisa. And that's because, Lisa, you connect with people on a really personal level. You understand the issues that citizens in this state struggle with, whether those are issues of foreclosed mortgages, whether those issues of consumer fraud, whether those issues of disability rights. You have been there for the people of this state in so many different ways. And because we're here tonight at a disability rights event, I'd just like, for Gerard's benefit, to understand some of the incredible work that the AG's office has done, collaborating with others in this room. In the United States, it wasn't long ago that people who were deaf and hard of hearing weren't able to really go to the movies and enjoy it until Equip for Equality and the Illinois Attorney General's office decided to take action against AMC theaters. And now all the theaters in the state and around they're moving beyond that, are making themselves accessible. And I know my friend Amber, who's here somewhere, talked to me about what it was like to be able to go to her first movie and really be there with everybody else. So thank you for that. That's just an example of the kind of Attorney General that we have, who understands disability rights and is willing to stand up for us. So without further ado, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Marka. So I wanted to take a moment to stop by and to say a few words in particular about the tremendous leadership and work of Marka Bristow and Access Living. I think all of us in this room recognize that we are really lucky and blessed to have so many terrific leaders in the city, in the state, and at the national level, and we all know that Marka just shines in that arena. And because of the fact that she has been so dedicated for so many years to ensuring that people with disabilities not only have full access, but also have full opportunity to participate, we have made some incredible changes and necessary changes here again. in Illinois and in the country, and tonight we're going to hear about some of the work that is taking place on the international level, where we also need to get the United States to move a little more, right? But unfortunately, I think we all recognize that the reason that this advocacy and leadership has needed to be taken is because we really have what I would call a shameful history of discrimination against people with disabilities. They have been excluded from meaningful work. They have been excluded from full participation in our society. And so certainly Marka and others in the disability rights movement have worked to confront this history of segregation, mistreatment, and paternalism. And the fight is ongoing, but we also need to stop every once in a while and recognize our successes. So the 1988 amendments to the Fair Housing Act, which covered people with disabilities as well as their families. And then we're coming up very shortly on the 25th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. And I point both of those out because those are two significant legal changes that Marka and other leaders around the country had a very significant hand in making sure that that happened. You know that Marka has also, as I mentioned, really expanded her view and is working on an international basis, and she is currently the board president of the United States International Council on Disabilities. And that role is really what I think has led us to allowing this evening's speaker to come and join us, until I found out that in fact he was a relative of Jean Butson, so they can fight over who gets to take full credit. But we're very excited to have Professor Quinn here. As you probably know, because Marka told you when you were invited, he's a leading authority on international disability law and policy, including the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So the convention, similar to the ADA, promotes values of independence and equal access for people with disabilities. And I want to say that on behalf of all of the co-sponsors of tonight's event, I know that my office and all of you share a commitment to ensuring the rights of people with disabilities. We are all in this room because Marka wouldn't have invited us if we weren't dedicated to fighting discrimination in all areas. We all understand that disability rights are civil rights, and we understand that these issues impact us all. And so we are optimistic that the convention will increase respect, independence, and access for people with disabilities internationally. And at the same time, we also know that there is still a lot of work to do here in our own backyard. So I want to say thank you to Marka, thank you to Professor Quinn, thank you to all the leaders that I'm looking out at and not specifically recognizing in this room, because there is much more that we need to do to fight discrimination and to ensure that there is a place at the table for everyone. So thank you all for being here, but thank you for the work that you do on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month, year-to-year basis to make our society a better place for everybody. It's appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
The other one works very well.
Hello. Thank you so much, Lisa. I overheard Gerard asking Lisa on behalf of the first woman Attorney General in Ireland to come on over to Ireland, and they would gladly host them. So I, of course, volunteered to go to introduce the Attorney General.
Right, I'm going to Ireland.
Yeah. Okay, so this is my real honor to be able to introduce my good friend Gerard Quinn. I want to say a little bit about him formally, and then Jean, who you've heard a little bit about, is going to add a little more to my introduction, and then we'll turn it over to Gerard. And we're going to keep it short. Gerard Quinn, Professor Quinn, leads a Center on Disability Law and Policy in Ireland, which uses the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities to help generate options for change throughout the world. He sits on the Council of State in Ireland, which advises the President of Ireland on constitutional matters. He co-chairs the disability program with me as the co-chairs of the Human Rights Watch Disability Advisory Committee, and he sits on many other boards, including the Soros Open Society Foundation. He's a former official in the European Commission and directs many research projects for the Commission, including the world's first PhD network on the UN CRPD. But aside from all that stuff, I first became friends with Gerard when the UN drafting process was underway. At the time, I was serving as Vice President, it sounds like a really cool thing, Vice President for North America of Rehabilitation International. And RI was the convener of the NGOs that were coming to New York 2 weeks at a time, twice a year for 5 years? 5 or 6? 5 years to work on this incredible thing called the Disability Rights Treaty. And the little backstory, I don't know if you're going to go through that, Gerard, but Gerard, I was chair of NCD at the time, and we were in the process of pulling together an opinion piece on whether there should be a convention on the rights of people with disabilities, or whether we should amend the existing human rights apparatus that existed. And Gerard and another incredible woman, Dr. Degener, were working on a research project, and lo and behold, before all of us could get our act together, the president of Mexico charged his delegation to go in and introduce a resolution to consider the crafting of a treaty on the rights of people with disabilities. There's more to the story than that, but that's where we first met. And Gerard was hired by RI as our expert. He was the person who we turned to for our consultation on the language in the treaty. And for me, why that was such an important experience is because during most of the crafting, the United States took the position that we didn't need a treaty, and at the very beginning, we weren't even in the room. After a while, the United States sent delegates to the process and were then allowed to answer questions that would come up. So honestly, my work with RI and my work with Gerard was my only way as a disabled American to have voice in the process, because our delegate wasn't there to carry our voice. So we had to go through other channels to bring the expertise that we had. By the end of the process, the instructions changed. That's another story in and of itself. But throughout that process, Gerard was very clear on one thing. And I think this comes from being the father of a child with a disability, now a young adult with a disability. And that is, it was our voice that had to lead the process. He was our technician, if I might say it that way, but he respected so much the motto that was throughout that room, which was nothing about us without us. And for the first time, when the treaty was crafted, because the diplomats who came there did not understand disability at all, we were given formal voice in the formal process, something that's never occurred in the history of the UN before. We could speak when recognized the same way country diplomats could. I understand that others are jealous of us for having been able to do that. So anyway, I really just have to say that in addition to all of what he's done technically, Gerard's my really good friend. I was so proud a few years ago when his whole family came here, you'll hear more about that, and rode with us on the Access Living float in the Disability Pride Parade, which this year is July 19th. So I hope you'll all be there. I'm going to turn the rest of the introduction over to Jean Butson, my good friend, former executive director of Lakefront SRO, and now chief principal of Mission Plus Strategies.
Oh, thank
Did I
you.
get that right?
Yeah, you did that very good. Hi, everybody. It's really great to be here, and Marka, thank you so much for asking me to do this. And so I'm going to give a little bit of the personal side about Gerard and just take him down a few notches. He was just a little too high, I think, there. So, like, Gerard, I'm afraid that was just, we got to give the human side here a little bit. So, I have known Gerard for a long time for both of us. And I think it's important to establish that Gerard's connection to the United States actually started before he was born. our grandmothers, Nora and Catherine Frawley, were born in Milltown Malbay, County Clare, Ireland. And back in the early part of the 20th century, they emigrated from Ireland to the United States to come here for work. My grandmother, Catherine, stayed and eventually settled in Chicago, and Jared's grandmother returned to Ireland to raise a family. Unfortunately, the two sisters never saw each other again, and like a lot of immigrant experiences, this story might have ended there, except 50 years later, my family got kind of curious about its Irish relatives who were over on the other side of the pond, as they say, and started going over to visit in County Clare. And as a result of renewing those ties, Jared came to stay with my family when he was 19 years old one summer. He came here to work and to get to know our family. We got to know him. And I like to think that that was really the beginning of his relationship with the United States, which has really grown and blossomed into an amazing relationship with this country, that if you get to know him at all, you will quickly learn that he probably knows a lot more about U.S. history than you, and even sometimes than my own husband, who writes U.S. history textbooks. He's an amazing Americanophile and just an amazing person. So after he returned to Ireland, he went to university and then went on to law school, met his amazing wife, Anne. They got married and then went to Boston, where Jared was accepted into a PhD program for law at Harvard University. And that's where his love for US history and politics was really fully ignited. So after getting his PhD, Jared and Anne returned to Ireland, started a family, and had 3 daughters, and their oldest daughter, Neve, was born with spina bifida in 1989. So when I got married, my husband Jim, who's in the back of the room, along with some of our family members, and Jim can wave, we went over, we honeymooned in Ireland and established our own relationships there, and that began a series of trips that we had, meeting and getting to know our Irish relatives, and they have since, Jared and his family, come here, and other relatives have come here, and many of our relatives have gone over there. And so we have a very close bond with Jared and his family, and our children now have a close bond as well, and I hope that that bond is going to continue into the next generation. So I expect that Nora and Catherine, our grandmothers, would be really happy to know that I'm sitting here today helping to introduce Jared at this event this evening, and that really the Frawley Circle is really unbroken. So Jared, welcome to the United States again. We look forward with great anticipation what you're going to say. And Marka, thank you again for giving me this opportunity to help introduce him. And just so you know, there are some Frawley people walking around name tags saying Frawley Clan, so now you know why.
Thank you, Cousin Jean. But these transatlantic relationships matter a lot. And the words of Abraham Lincoln come to my mind. It's the mystic chord of memories that unite people. It's not international law or politics, it's actually the human touch. And it really matters a lot that families stay in touch and value their roots and their connections over time. And thank you, Marka. It's been a real honor and pleasure to work with you in various different fora at various different times. And it's amazing to see people who are very experienced, but also develop really intense insight and wisdom from that experience. And Marka is one of them, and an amazing agent of change, as we like to say. So it is true that I went to a lesser known college on the eastern seaboard called Harvard, but that was before I knew you had the best universities here in Chicago, so I'm sorry about that. So I want to do a few things. I want to look at the UN Disability Treaty, and I want to, I suppose, give you or leave you with one important message. Whether you ratify it or not, it's yours already. It's recognizably an American tract. In fact, it would not have happened without you. I don't mean to say that it happened because you were present during the negotiations, although you were midway through, but it's the ideas, it's the inventive thinking, it's the insistence on the dignity and the equality of each human being that originated here and lit a fuse and then took fire right throughout the world. And you will notice nothing alien in this convention. It's very much an American tract, and it's very much yours. And in actual fact, it's this sharing between domestic innovation and international and regional law and policy that's commonplace, happens all the time. And in this particular instance stretches back at least 30 years, if not more. So don't view it in isolation as a pinprick in point of time in history. It's a product of attacking back and forth the relationship between your law and policy and international disability law and policy. So I want to unpack that sharing to give you kind of like the fabric within which you can situate this and then own it as yours, whether you ratify or not. Hopefully you will ratify. Second thing I want to do is just slice and dice it and give you a sense of its sinews, what the core foundational premises are. And again, you will find nothing here that's strikingly at odds with where you're coming from, where you're at, and where you're going. Again, the core message is this is yours already. Third thing I want to do is tell you a little bit about the impact. I've written myself about the temptation of elegance. Beware the temptation of elegance. We don't want to produce beautiful jurisprudence out there in the ether, in the UN system, in Geneva or New York. We want to bring about change at home. And we want to have the voices at the table that are important to bring about that change. So I want to tell you something about its impact closer to home for me, not meaning Ireland, meaning the European Union. You may or you may not know that in addition to its member states, the European Union as such has ratified this treaty some 4 or 5 years ago. And it's already bearing very interesting fruit, very constructive fruit, and the auguries are pretty good at the European Union level, and I want to give you a flavour of that. And lastly, I want to impart to you from my point of view, not from an American point of view, but for why I think the international community needs you to ratify this treaty, or rather why it would be beneficial for everybody in the international community to have the United States on board, so to speak. So, first of all, I should maybe explain that I never started out in disability law and policy. All life is a series of accidents, as you know. I keep telling postgraduate students a career is never something you build, it's something you look back on. There are lots of twists and turns in your life, and be open to them and embrace them. I started as a legal historian. My PhD thesis at Harvard was about the discussion between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson about what it means to live in a civic republic. And I'm a keen student of Jefferson. I love him and I hate him at the same time, I'll have to frankly admit. But one thing that really struck me from Jefferson, and one thing I carry over into all of the disability work, including my attitude toward the drafting of the UN Disability Treaty, was to Jefferson, freedom is not freedom solely to remain detached or protected from power. Real freedom is the right to belong, the right to be present, the right to feel as if there's something bigger than yourself, the right to contribute and give no matter how small, and the right to be valued as a citizen on an equal basis with others in so doing. This is what the ancients called public freedom, and it's just important in the tradition of civic republicanism, as are your classic civil libertarian rights to be protected against power. And to me, you see, the Americans with Disabilities Act is a Jeffersonian tract. It's all about ending those dark places. It's all about admitting people into the public sphere, the life world, whether it be education or employment or social interaction and so forth. And I guess the core message from the ADA, at least to me as a foreigner, was treat people as subjects and not as objects, and open up public space for people to flourish and to belong and to contribute, no matter how small that contribution is. It's still a valued contribution. And I should say, the thing that turned me towards disability law and policy, well, it was two things, 1989 and 1990. 1989, our first daughter was born. We have three beautiful daughters, and she had a disability. A few months later, we were watching TV and we saw George Bush #1 sign into law the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I remember distinctly telling myself, we can do something like that here too. And by here, I didn't mean in Ireland. I meant at European Union level, and thankfully we have. And the rest is kind of history. And the thing that really struck home around the world, you'd be amazed. It was like those shots in Lexington and Concord, the enactment of the ADA. You'll find people discussing the ADA in little villages in Kenya, in little villages in Bulgaria. It's quite astounding the impact it has, not because of its content, it's pretty hard to understand even as a lawyer, but because of the core message, right? That people count, and we need to have an equal opportunities frame of reference to create space, to bulldoze away barriers, and to create space for people. That idea really lies at the heart of the UN Treaty. But just to give you a sense of the flavor of the sharing of ideas and values that's actually normal at the international level, not abnormal, let me, I suppose, go back a little bit into history and unfold it in ways that I think make sense. I think the discussion about having a different way of looking at disability really started not long after Brown against the Board of Education. There were a whole bunch of people here in this country in the 60s scratching their heads saying, there's a deep logic there. It's fundamentally subversive of the way things are. And actually that deep logic applies just as much to us as it does to people of color and other minorities in this country. And they had a strategic choice, which was either to amend the Civil Rights Act and include disability, which politically was never going to happen, right? Because disability was not included in the '64 Civil Rights Act, or we could enact more specific disability-grounded laws that embodied an equal opportunities philosophy. So you had a lot happening in this country at the level of ideas in the 60s, and then you had two concrete pieces of legislation in the 70s, the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, the very first non-discrimination law on disability in the world. Take credit for that. And then you had the Education of All Handicapped Children, subsequently retitled later on, which is still an exemplar throughout the world for the achievement of inclusive education. Not perfect, but at least it embodies an idea that everybody can subscribe to. Right around the same time, and very much influenced by what was happening here in the United States, the United Nations decided they would inaugurate a world program of action and a decade of action on disability in the early 1980s. So in point of time, quite close to the innovations happening in the US, and I would say very heavily influenced by what was happening in the US. The interesting thing about it was that it didn't focus on what you were beginning to crystallize for yourselves here, which was the equal opportunities philosophy. It actually focused on prevention and rehabilitation. The rehabilitation side you can understand, given the legacy of wars in the world, the First World War, Second World War. Prevention is a little bit more difficult to understand. And the equal opportunity stuff tucked in at the end. Watch what happens. What is backgrounded becomes foregrounded at the international level, according as you perfect the model in as much as one can perfect the equal opportunities model. In the late 1980s, you might be interested to know Sweden and Italy proposed a UN treaty on the rights of people with disabilities. Now, there were very narrow tracks, 2 pages long or something like that, but at least they saw what was coming. And the international community did not follow the entailment of the logic. They did not follow it because there was treaty fatigue. They had ideological disputes over drafting the Rights of the Child Convention. Cold War was still going on in the 1980s, and they said, no, we need a break from this. But then what happened is you guys perfected or crystallized the Equal Opportunities philosophy in the Americans with Disabilities Act. And shortly after that, only 3 years later, this shows how ideas spread rapidly, the United Nations adopts what's known as the United Nations Standard Rules on the Equalization of Opportunities for Disabilities. That's a bloody long mouthful, okay? But the thing to remember about it is that it picks up and it runs with the core idea of the ADA, which is equal opportunities stroke non-discrimination. And note that it's only 3 years after the adoption of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So then people were saying to them throughout the 90s, it's kind of nice to have that crystallized in a soft, fuzzy, woolly, UN-speak document. Maybe we can take this a bit further. The Americans have taken it further, why can't we take it further? And that's when people in the 1990s began first debating seriously whether we should migrate upward toward an internationally binding instrument. And by the way, internationally binding instrument has really expressive value, more than it has hard legal value in the way that you would understand it in a domestic jurisdiction. So the level of ideas, it really matters that you move it up to that level, and it symbolizes that we're serious about the shift in values. There's a few things that helped it along. One was one of my countrymen, countrywoman, Mary Robinson, was appointed to the UN High Commission for Human Rights, and she created space within that apparatus to move the disability issue away from welfare, away from managing people, and into a justice discourse, and therefore into an equal opportunities discourse. So the space she opened up was very, very important at that moment in time. Also, there were resolutions coming through in the UN Human Rights Commission. It's since been changed to the UN Human Rights Council on disability every 2 years. And if I put my hand on my heart and say they were as boring as hell. If you read them, you just nod off to sleep on your law desk or wherever you'd be reading them. But it was Mary Robinson and a few others who said, well, let's up the ante. Let's actually put something in here about taking seriously the option of drafting a legally binding instrument at the international level. 1 or 2 countries tried that and got huge pushback on it. And the argumentation, and it's eerily reminiscent of the argumentation today about whether we need a new UN treaty on the rights of older people. By the way, I think we do. The argumentation was, it's too early yet. The system, the existing system, can be made work better. Let's try and make it work better in the UN before we'd even think about having a treaty. So at that point in time, Mary Robinson's office asked me and Professor Degener to actually conduct the study, to actually explore whether the existing system was working well or not at the international level. And lo and behold, we discovered it wasn't, or rather not so much we discovered, we proved it wasn't. So therefore we created the clearing for a fresh debate on whether a new instrument was required. And by the way, although we weren't exposed to do this, I don't know if I ever told you this, Marka, but we put in a chapter at the end saying no matter how much you can perfect the existing system, there are still good arguments to be made that we need to shift a gear and to actually adopt a binding instrument. And apparently they weren't expecting that, which is why you'll find our names on the cover of the report. Because in the UN system, the authors' names are buried deep, but they decided in order to give themselves plausible deniability, they'd put our names front up on the report. That's why it's called the Quinn-Degener report. We didn't realize this until years later, to be frank. But even before the issue could come back, Mexico, as it were, took the lead. And thank God they did. They did the world a huge service. They went into the UN General Assembly. They got a resolution from the UN General Assembly, which, as lawyers will know, is full of weasel words. It didn't say we're going to draft a treaty. It said we'll set up an ad hoc committee of states to consider proposals for drafting a treaty. That was to leave space for that ad hoc committee to say, no, we don't need a treaty. Okay, and I guess the hope and expectation of many states is that the ad hoc committee would actually conclude, no, we don't need a treaty. And by the way, ad hoc meant ad hoc. Any state that wanted to come along could come along. It was also ad hoc in the sense that civil society people were present. Now, initially they couldn't even talk, but a beautiful thing happened at the first ad hoc committee in August of 2002. I'll never forget it. It was so bloody hot for me as an Irish person in New York City, although I love New York City. One of the things they did decide was that civil society organizations could be present and could speak. They can't vote because a treaty is an instrument of states and they vote on the treaty, but they could speak. Mind you, they could only speak after the state delegations spoke, but that's okay. That's okay. And by the end of the process, 4.5 years later, states were actually competing with each other to really understand what the civil society organizations were state, to really get their heads around what the equal opportunities philosophy really meant for people, and then to craft proposals for the text accordingly. So the result of having those voices in the room was the instrument has a sharpness that it might otherwise lack. The raw edge was always present. And it was just wonderful to see how state delegations were more and more open to that, as well as more educated by that. And in fact, most of the delegations brought people with disabilities onto their national delegations. So for example, Germany had Theresia Degener sitting on their delegation. And by the way, Theresia is now a member of the UN committee that monitors the implementation of the convention. So it was kind of an accident of the process, but a crucially important accident of the process that created the space for those voices. So it began a little bit inauspiciously, and I think Marka has been hinting at that, but it really took off when the diplomats decided they would do the honorable thing. They would create a working group of states who were experts on the issue, 27 states from around the world, divided up geographically, equitably, and all the rest of it, and 6 global disability DPOs. A DPO is an NGO of persons with disabilities, not the professionals, not the professional voice filtering the voice of the person with disability, but actually the authentic voice, so to speak. And I was fortunate enough to lead the delegation of Rehabilitation International during those 2 weeks. And it's funny, it was January 2004, which is the coldest I've ever been in the United States. So we ran from the hottest to the coldest. It was quite an amazing 2 weeks. So they produced the guts of the treaty, which is basically the treaty you have today. There were some changes along the way, but essentially that was where the heavy lifting was done. If I wanted to just summarize it, I would say this is a treaty that's founded pretty much exclusively on the equal opportunities philosophy that you crystallized in this country over several decades. It's an attempt to get it and to frame it and to make it accessible as language to countries that never heard of this before. You can't understand how hard it is to even translate reasonable accommodation into Chinese and Russian and Bulgarian. The ideas behind it, they don't translate well unless you really pay a lot of attention to it. So that is the overarching philosophy. In fact, the purpose of the convention is very simple. It's to ensure the full and equal enjoyment of human rights by all persons with disabilities. I was arguing it should be the full and equal and effective enjoyment of all human rights, but 2 out of 3 ain't bad. And the rights themselves, if you read it, there's about 30 articles that go through substantive rights. Don't be thrown off by the substantive domain that they cover. Social security, education, employment. What you really have to do is read those rights from within the frame of equal opportunities and non-discrimination. That really is the rust solvent that makes everything accessible in this particular treaty. If I were to slice and dice them and break them up into accessible tranches of rights and provisions, it would be like this. You have 3 basic tranches. You have the first one that focuses on what I call personhood, which is really an homage to the dignity and the inherent self-worth of each individual, regardless of disability, and by the way, regardless of type of disability and regardless of severity of disability. So it's really all about restoring voice and control to the person over their own lives with respect to services that affect them, and creates the possibility for human flourishing, even if, okay, you choose to do something really small in your life, it matters to you. So the personhood rights are really important, and by the way, it was your colleague Lex Friedan, who also used to chair the US National Council on Disability, who was the originator of the article on the right to live independently and be included in the community. That's yours. We can trace the lineage right back to you. That's not somebody else telling you what to do, okay? The second tranche of rights are really familiar to you, which have to do with accessibility, either in the built environment, more importantly in the virtual environment, because that's where the economy is moving, that's where society is moving. Mind you, I haven't, my daughters are on Facebook, but I'm not. And there's even very interesting stuff in there about thinking through how our existing intellectual property regimes amount to barriers, for example, to blind persons accessing knowledge and cultural material. There is what's called a book famine in the world today. So 10% of all of the books in your law school shelves, only 10% of them are accessible to blind users. That's a travesty. And we have it within our means to change that. And that's what the relevant provision in the convention requires. And I'm really delighted to say that the United States Commerce Department took a lead in drafting the Marrakesh Treaty to actually liberalize copyright laws to allow for much, much fuller access to the books that are out there for blind persons and so forth. The last tranche is really what I call participation rights. Your right to be present, whether it be in education or in employment or in the other spheres of the life world, if you want to call it that. At least that's what Jürgen Habermas calls it. And every time I quote Jürgen Habermas, my spell checker says, "Do you mean jargon?" And I said, "Okay, yeah, I do." So really, really important. And it covers things like access to justice, participation in the political process. That's how you exert collective voice to bring about change. The right to form your own associations, your own NGOs, and the right to be present and so forth. Let me say a little bit of word about not so much the rights, okay, but actually the process requirements of the convention, because I actually think this is the heart of the convention. There is a number of innovative articles that says governments must listen to people with disabilities. They must be present. Their voice has to be at the table in terms of policies and indeed decisions that affect them. Now that's not to say that you dictate the outcomes, because as John F. Kennedy said, to govern means to choose, and therefore governors have to choose responsibly, and therefore you're not going to be always having a veto over government policy. But one of the problems of the past is the voices just weren't there. So the convention really tries to reverse that, tries to actually open up what I call a different politics of disability, a different presence of people with disabilities at the table. And by the way, that means you have to develop skills not so much in parsing Article 9 or Article 12 or Article 15, but in becoming a policy entrepreneur, bringing solutions to the table to government. That's what you guys are good at, but that's not what the rest of the world is good at, and we need to learn from you. There also is an obligation for governments to put in place an architecture of change. Now you have this already because the democratic reflex is embedded deep in your culture. But what it means for other countries is that they have to have a focal point within government on disability. Most of them don't. They have to have a coordination mechanism in place. And look what happens if coordination breaks through and you fall through the cracks. The results are much worse for people with disabilities than they are for others. So this government design stuff really matters. Furthermore, governments are obliged to have in place a reality check. Now, your reality check could be the NCD, which has shown great courage over the years in holding government to account, or it could be other mechanisms. The way we interpret that is it's going to have to be a Civil Rights Commission or a Human Rights Commission, or somebody who can independently do a dipstick test and see how you're doing and say to government, you've made some mistakes here, let's learn from the mistakes. And last but not least, the voice of people with disabilities has to be in that architecture of change. This is what I call the triangulation of change between government, some independent reality checking mechanism, and the voice of people with disabilities themselves. Hand on heart, to me, this is more important than the substantive rights, Because if you give people the wherewithal to bring about change, generally the right kind of change comes about. And that's pretty important. There's a whole section on obligations, which I won't go through and bore you to death with, but suffice it to say, the core obligation on governments is to think about what they're doing. It's as simple as that. Reflect honestly on where you've come from. If you find something that's egregious and doesn't quite meet the standards of what we would accept as being in accordance with an equal opportunities philosophy, find a way of either dealing with it, getting rid of it, or replacing it with something better into the future. What it's really calling on for is a reflective form of governance, to be looking back and to be looking forward. You don't have to worry about that. This is something that's embedded quite deep into your DNA and so on and so forth. Let me briefly tell you why and how this is making a difference at European Union level. It might shock you to learn that the European Union has actually ratified this convention. The reason we had the legal capacity to ratify the convention is because of you. In 1997, well, backstory, the European Union is really Hamilton's idea of a great commercial republic, right? It's a common market between all of the member states of the European Union. But throughout the 80s and the 90s, they said, we've got to be more than that. We're going to have to aspire to some form of political union. And by the way, we're going to have to accrete to ourselves legal competence to show our human face. So what do they look to? They look to Section 5 of your 14th Amendment. That's the one that gives Congress, if it's so minded, it's not forced to, if it's so minded, to adopt measures to combat discrimination. So we kind of cut and paste, I call it honorable plagiarism, okay? We cut and paste from Section 5 of the 14th Amendment into the Treaty of Amsterdam, which is one of the founding treaties of the European Union. That capacity to combat discrimination, guess what? That was the provision we relied upon as providing an adequate legal base for the European Union to ratify the convention. What does that tell you? That tells you we weren't scared by all of the detail of the convention. What we grasped was that the equal opportunities philosophy was at its heart, and it's fundamentally compatible with the non-discrimination equal opportunities provisions in the European Union treaties, period. End of story. So it's because of you that we were actually enabled to ratify the convention under the Article 13 of the Treaty of Amsterdam, if you want to know the exact thing. Now, why is it important? European Union only has limited powers conferred on it by the member states. And it's only within the sphere of those limited powers or competencies that its answerability to the UN under the UN Convention is engaged. There are a whole host of exclusive powers that the European Union has, mostly to do with the common market, but there's also a web of shared powers that the Union has. And we kind of have, we don't call it this, but we kind of have a preemption doctrine that you have here that says if the federal government exercises the power, the states lose it. Likewise, if the states exercises it first, the federal power loses it. So one of those areas of shared competence is what we call the structural funds. What are they in a nutshell? Well, in any market economy, in any continental market economy, you're going to find weaker parts and stronger parts. So it's fundamentally unconscionable that you just allow the loss to lie where it falls. So we've put together a multi-billion euro fund to assist the weaker regions, the weaker member states, the weaker economies, either in terms of their infrastructure or in terms of human capital, preparing people for next generation jobs. That really began with the closure of the coal mines throughout Belgium, England and France in the 1980s, when whole towns were left bereft. There were no other industries, and then the Europeans stepped in and tried to retrain the coal workers and so forth. Okay, guess what? In the previous programming period, which is 80 billion euros, right, like $1 trillion, some countries in Eastern Europe use this money to build new institutions for people with disabilities, to open brand new institutions or to refurbish existing ones, or to claim that they were engaging in community services, whereas in fact they were actually just simply rebranding their institutions as community services. So I'm paying for this out of my tax euros. It's grossly inefficient, and it's morally objectionable, plus it violates the European Union's obligations under the relevant provisions of the UN Treaty on transitioning away from institutional services into the community. So they were coming to the end of the eight-year programming period. New regulations was required, and the European Commission, where I used to work, proposed that there would be what's called an ex-ante conditionality. Now, to you or I, that just means you can't get a dime unless you prove you comply with this condition. And that conditionality is that you have a transition plan in place to close down your institutions and move people to the community. If you have, we'll help you. If you don't, we won't, okay? The Council of Ministers removed that conditionality, and then the fight was on. And we joined forces. When I say we, I say we in the disability community at European level, with elder rights groups, as well as with children's rights groups, to argue that those conditions should be restored to the structural funds. And after a protracted 2-year battle, I'm delighted to say that not only is the conditionality restored, but the guidance that the European Commission gives to its field officers is much better than even I could have written it. It says not only will we not fund these institutions anymore, but also we won't even refurbish existing institutions. So Poland or Ireland or Romania, if you have institutions that fall foul of even minimum standards under international law, you're responsible for that. We're not responsible for that in the European Union. But tell you what, if you really are serious about closing down these institutions, we're going to help you. We'll provide the funding, the bridge funding that enables you to keep 2 systems going for a period and then ultimately close them down. So that was really, really successful. It's an example of how we used positively the convention. And I think one of the secrets of the success is not doing it on a disability ground alone, but actually doing it with older people's groups as well as children. By the way, there's 8 million children in the world living in institutions, only about 2.5 million of whom are disabled. Some of the rest are what's called social orphancy in the former Soviet sphere. That is to say, if your family is in extreme circumstances, the first and only option was to actually institutionalize the child. So I think that's a good success story, and it's not one that breaks the bank. Okay, and I want to leave you with just 3 reasons why I think we need you, okay? The first one it really has to do with the fact that it's yours already. It's recognizably based on where you're coming from, and it's like having Hamlet without the prince. We really need you in the room because, of course, you're the originator of the ideas, and we can only grow these ideas together. The second one is process. If the heart of this is putting in place a different politics of disability, we need to be developing the policy entrepreneurship skills, and we need you to be able to do that because nobody else is doing that. And last but not least, we need to grow markets together. A lot of countries now are developing accessibility standards to, as it were, capture the next markets around the world. And guess what? They're European companies. They're not American companies. We need to be doing this together to do not just the right thing, but also the efficient thing for all of our citizens, not just those with disabilities. I'll leave you one parting reflection from Thomas Jefferson. He said basically each generation has to basically reimagine or recommit itself to a theory of ordered liberty in a democracy. And my sense is that one generation has done a huge amount in enacting the ADA. Now it's time for the next generation of Americans to join the world. Thank you.